Hi everyone, welcome back to another World Wars history video. Today I will be covering some concepts that I may not have covered in the last videos. Firstly, let's talk about conscription and propaganda that was used in World War I and World War II. Conscription is simply required enlistment in the armed forces. When young, able-bodied men met the requirement, they were forced to enlist in the war. As a recap from last month's videos, World War I started in the July of 1914, and within a few years, they realized the true scope of war. They needed more manpower, and fast. The Canadian government settled on conscripting young men for overseas military service since voluntary recruitment was not sufficient. About 400,000 Canadians had been registered for conscription, but only 100,000 were actually accepted. Only 24,000 of these conscripted soldiers actually served at the front lines, some of them playing very crucial parts in the war and helping to strengthen army divisions that were diminishing. When World War II started in the September of 1939, Canadian Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King was hesitant on whether conscription be placed again or not. This was due to the fact that he wanted to preserve Canada's unity with the French MPs that were opposing conscription. They held a vote of which 79% of Quebec's population voted no for conscription, and 80% of the population of other provinces voted yes, allowing the federal government to pass conscription. In 1944, 16,000 men were recruited, and around 13,000 were sent overseas. Conscription was passed too late for the 13,000 soldiers to really make an impact, seeing how the war ended just a year later in 1945. When looking at conscription in World War I and World War II, we can notice a lot of similarities, but also many differences. For starters, during both wars, young able-bodied men were first to sign up for war, but as we learned, conscription played a much larger role in World War I than it did in World War II. Canada itself was forced to go into war because they were colonized by the British, and seeing how World War I was Canada's first war, Canada was not hesitant to use any methods to help assure victory, and it seamlessly passed conscription. This had changed in World War II though. They had to make the correct decisions without risking their country's unity. Propaganda is simply information that is used to promote a specific cause. In this case, it was used to encourage men to join the army and to encourage women to work in factories. In World War I, the use of propaganda was found on posters scattered across walls in Canada. They tried to evoke emotions of anger towards the enemy, making the men want to serve in the army to keep their country safe. There were also posters directed towards women, encouraging them to work in factories that produced ammunition, guns, and more. When World War II came along, technology had advanced rapidly. When it came to propaganda in World War II, the use of radio broadcasting was very common. The National Film Board also created propaganda films that would celebrate and display Canada's role in World War I, encouraging men to enlist in the war. It's hard to tell how many men actually enlisted in the war due to propaganda, but it must have been a lot because of how hard the government tried. In both wars, Canada had used propaganda to encourage men to join the war effort, and encourage women to also contribute to the war effort by working in munition factories. World War I used posters to spread propaganda, but in World War II, seeing a massive advancement in technology, radio broadcasts and films were the most prominent methods of propaganda. It is very important to mention Bipoc War Contributions. Bipoc stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. People who identify as BIPOC are discriminated against for being different. In World War I, around 4,000 Indigenous, 1,000 Black, and hundreds of Chinese and Japanese men joined the Canadian forces. These numbers were restricted because of racism. During the beginning of World War I, many BIPOC men wanted to enlist in the war, but were countlessly rejected because it was quote-unquote a white man's war. 2 years after the start of World War I, the resistance against BIPOC men joining the war was lifted, seeing how they were in desperate need of manpower. Indigenous men were the first to be enlisted, and they were called the Indian Unit. The vast majority of black volunteers that were allowed to join the war were not enlisted into combat units, and instead were put into the No. 2 Construction Battalion. They were tasked with building combat areas, landing facilities, and other work that was thought not to be meant for the white men. Bipoc men were treated cruelly and lesser than white men. They were either tasked with construction or put into combat units that were not very important to the war contribution. After World War I had ended, the Treaty of Versailles was brought up. The treaty terms included things like the surrender of German colonies and £6,600 million to be paid in war reparations, Canada being one of many countries that signed this treaty. In 1924, the United Nations was formed. The United Nations are an international organization whose main goal is to establish world peace and work on solving political, social, and economical problems in the world. Canada is a part of the United Nations and actually plays a very important role. They have been tasked with peacekeeping operations led by NATO, and their efforts were very vital in maintaining peace after World War I and World War II. Approximately 130 Canadians have died in peace operations. Thank you for watching.